The first thing I saw that morning was that ugly yellow boot glowing in the Georgia sun, like somebody had dropped a construction cone onto my truck just to ruin my day. For about 3 seconds, I honestly thought maybe one of my buddies was messing with me, because who the hell boots a pickup truck parked on private property? But then I saw the red warning tag hanging off the rim, flapping in the breeze like it owned the place, and right there in bold black letters it said community enforcement violation. That's when my stomach dropped, because I already knew exactly who this was. See, I live in a neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates, just outside Augusta. One of those quiet suburban developments where everybody smiles at each other in the mailbox line, but secretly keeps score over whose grass is too tall or whose nephew parked an RV in the driveway for 3 days too long. My house sits on a corner lot, a little over an acre, and behind my driveway there's this gravel turnaround that's technically part of my property. Been that way since the original survey back in the 80s. My dad helped me pour half the edging there when I bought the place after my divorce, and I still remember him standing out there with a cigarette hanging off his lips saying, "People only respect land when it costs them money." At the time I thought he was just being dramatic. Turns out he was a prophet. Now the neighborhood HOA had always been annoying, but mostly harmless. They'd send passive-aggressive emails about trash bins being visible from the street or complain if somebody painted their shutters the wrong shade of blue. Typical suburban nonsense. But things changed when they hired this private enforcement company called Ironclad Community Patrol. Those guys rolled around like they were policing Fallujah instead of a subdivision full of retirees and dads grilling burgers on weekends. And the worst one of them all was this guy named Trent Mercer. Tall dude, shaved head, mirrored sunglasses even when it was cloudy, always standing with his thumbs hooked into his vest like he wanted everybody to know he had authority. Nobody liked him, but everybody tolerated him because the HOA board kept saying he was improving neighborhood compliance, which, translated into English, meant he enjoyed bullying people over parking violations. About 2 months before the boot incident, Trent knocked on my door holding a clipboard like he was delivering a warrant. He said, "Sir, we've received complaints about unauthorized vehicle placement near the roadway." I remember laughing because my truck was literally parked beside my own mailbox. I said, "You mean my driveway?" He didn't laugh back. He just glanced toward the gravel pad and said, "That area falls under community access management." I told him, "No, it falls under county parcel number 14B, which I pay taxes on." That should have been the end of it. Instead, he gave me this tight little smile, the kind people give when they already decided they hate you, and said, "We'll verify that." From that point on, every interaction got weirder. One morning I caught him taking pictures of my Tacoma from across the street. Another time my neighbor Ellie told me she overheard him at an HOA meeting saying certain homeowners thought rules didn't apply to them. Funny thing is, I'd barely attended HOA meetings before all this. I mostly kept to myself, worked my job, grilled on Sundays, watched Braves games, paid my dues on time. But for whatever reason, Trent locked onto me like I'd personally insulted his ancestors. And standing there that Tuesday morning, sweat already creeping down my back, while cicadas screamed from the pine trees, staring at that boot cooking on my front tire, I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was personal. There was an invoice tucked under my wiper demanding $275 for removal, plus an additional $80 per day after 24 hours. At the bottom, in tiny little legal print, it said enforcement conducted under authority granted by Cedar Ridge Residential Association. I actually laughed again when I read that part, but this time it wasn't because it was funny. It was because I could feel something in me snap. Not explosive anger. Worse. That cold kind of anger where suddenly everything becomes very clear. I pulled out my phone and called the number on the tag. A woman answered sounding half asleep. I said, "Yeah, somebody illegally booted my truck." She asked for the violation number. I read it off. Keyboard clicking. Pause. Then she said, completely casual, "Payment can be processed over the phone." I said, "No, you don't understand. The truck is on my property." Another pause. Then she goes, "Sir, all roadside access zones in Cedar Ridge are enforceable under contract." That sentence right there. That was the moment I knew these people had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I looked back at my truck, at that ridiculous yellow boot shining in the sunlight, and I said quietly, "All right, if that's how y'all want to play this." Then I hung up. And that's where things stopped being about a parking dispute and started turning into a war over who actually owned the ground beneath my feet. I didn't go inside right away. I just stood there in the driveway with my phone in one hand and my coffee getting cold in the other, staring at that boot like it had personally insulted my family. Across the street, Old Man Dobbins was pretending to trim his hedges while very obviously watching the whole thing unfold, and a couple houses down somebody's sprinkler kept ticking back and forth across the sidewalk like a metronome. Everything looked normal, but I could feel it in my chest, that weird pressure where your instincts start whispering something isn't right. And here's the thing about me. I'm not some hot-headed guy looking for fights. I spent 12 years working insurance claims. My entire adult life has basically been paperwork, policy language, and listening to people lie with confidence. So when somebody pushes me into a corner, I don't swing first. I document. That afternoon, I dug out the original closing binder from my garage storage cabinet. Took me almost an hour because half the boxes still had labels from my divorce 3 years earlier. Funny how life works. Sometimes the paperwork from the worst period of your life ends up saving you in the next one. Buried under old tax returns and faded photographs was the original plat survey from 1987. And there it was, clear as day. The HOA roadway easement stopped 6 feet before the gravel turnaround began. I remember just sitting there at the kitchen table staring at the line on that map while sunlight came through the blinds. Because suddenly this wasn't a gray area anymore. Trent hadn't made a mistake. Ironclad hadn't misunderstood the boundary. They knew. Or worse, they never cared. That realization honestly bothered me more than the boot itself. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing a person in authority can just decide reality works however they want that day. So I started gathering everything. I photographed the gravel pad from every angle. I measured the distance from the asphalt edge to the survey markers. I even dug up county GIS maps online and printed screenshots showing the parcel boundary. At one point, my neighbor Ellie walked over holding a glass of sweet tea and asked, "You building a murder case or something?" I laughed and told her, "Depends how the next few days go." But underneath the joke, I was furious. Not loud furious. Focused furious. And meanwhile, Trent kept circling like a shark. The next morning, he rolled slowly past my house in one of those white, ironclad SUVs. I was outside taking pictures near the mailbox when he stopped in the street and lowered his window. "You planning to pay the fee?" he asked. I said, "You planning to remove an illegal boot?" That smug little smile showed up again. He leaned one arm on the window and said, "You know, most people just cooperate instead of escalating things." I actually remember grinning at that because the irony was unbelievable. I said, "That's funny coming from a guy trespassing on private property." His expression tightened immediately. For the first time, I could see a crack in the armor. Not fear exactly, but irritation. Like he wasn't used to people pushing back. Then he hit me with the line that really told me who he was. He said, "People like you are exactly why communities fall apart. People like you." Man, that sat with me. Because suddenly this wasn't about parking anymore. In his mind, I represented something. Somebody who questioned authority. Somebody who embarrassed him publicly. Maybe somebody who reminded him he wasn't actually in control. And honestly, I think Trent needed control more than he needed oxygen. After he drove off, Ellie walked over from across the street, shaking her head. She said quietly, "You know he's been targeting people, right?" That got my attention. Turns out I wasn't the first. An older widow named Mrs. Kessler got fined because her grandson parked on the curb during Thanksgiving. Another family had their work trailer towed, even though they'd gotten prior approval from the HOA board. Most people just paid because fighting felt exhausting. That's how these companies survive. Not because they're right. Because they bet you're too tired to challenge them. Well, unfortunately for Trent Mercer, I had recently quit drinking, was sleeping terribly, and suddenly had a whole lot of emotional energy with nowhere healthy to go. So I kept digging. The county zoning office was about 30 minutes away, this ugly beige government building with flickering fluorescent lights that somehow smelled like dust and burnt coffee at the same time. I ended up sitting across from a zoning planner named Denise Holloway, a woman probably in her 60s with reading glasses hanging around her neck and the energy of someone who'd seen every flavor of human stupidity imaginable. I handed her the survey map. She studied it for maybe 20 seconds before saying, "Oh, they booted you there?" That pause afterward told me everything. I asked, "You've heard about these guys before?" She leaned back in her chair real slowly. Then she said, "Off the record? Ironclad's been pushing boundaries for over a year. HOA boards hire companies like that because they promise aggressive enforcement. Problem is, eventually aggressive turns into unlawful." Then she tapped the map with her pen. "This area isn't HOA controlled. Never was. I swear to God." Hearing those words felt better than therapy. I asked if she'd put that in writing. She smiled. "Already figured you'd ask." By the time I walked out of that office with an official zoning verification letter in my hand, something had changed inside me. The anger was still there, but now it had structure, direction. I stopped thinking emotionally and started thinking strategically. That night, I typed up a formal demand letter citing unlawful vehicle immobilization statutes under state law, attached copies of the survey, the zoning confirmation, timestamped photographs, and a demand for immediate removal plus damages. Then I emailed copies to Ironclad, the HOA board, and every board member individually. And because I'm petty when properly motivated, I also CC'd the neighborhood legal committee. At 8:14 the next morning, my phone rang. "Trent." I answered on speaker while making eggs. He didn't even say hello. "You're causing a lot of unnecessary problems." I flipped a piece of bacon and said, "Pretty sure the unnecessary problem is still attached to my tire." His voice got sharper. "You think you're going to intimidate us with paperwork?" That sentence almost made me laugh. Because paperwork was literally my entire skill set. I said, "No, Trent. I think I'm going to bankrupt you with paperwork." Silence. Just breathing on the line for a second. Then he lowered his voice and said something that honestly still gives me chills thinking about it. "You should really consider letting this go before things get uglier." Now, there are moments in life where you suddenly realize the other person has mistaken kindness for weakness. This was one of those moments. I turned off the stove, picked up the phone, and said very calmly, "Did you just threaten me over a parking dispute?" Immediate backpedaling. "That's not what I meant. You're overreacting." "No, Trent. I think y'all got real comfortable bullying people who couldn't fight back." And then I hung up on him. About an hour later, I got a call from the HOA president, a nervous accountant named Richard Bellamy, who suddenly sounded like a hostage negotiator. He said, "We'd really prefer to resolve this privately." Translation, they were starting to panic. Because somewhere between my evidence packet, Denise's zoning letter, and Trent's phone call, somebody finally realized this situation could blow up in spectacular fashion. And the funniest part? The boot was still on my truck while they were panicking. By the fourth day, the whole neighborhood knew. Not because I told people, because suburban neighborhoods operate like small medieval villages with better landscaping. Everybody talks. Every dog walker, every retiree with binoculars, every mom pushing a stroller past my driveway slowed down to stare at the now infamous yellow boot sitting on my Tacoma like some kind of public monument to HOA stupidity. And honestly, the longer it stayed there, the worse it made Ironclad look. That's the part those companies never understand. Power only works when people believe you're legitimate. Once people start laughing at you, it's over. Richard Bellamy called me twice that Friday trying to smooth things out, which usually means somebody's attorney just explained the definition of liability. He kept using phrases like unfortunate misunderstanding and procedural confusion, and every time he talked, I could practically hear sweat dripping through his polo shirt. But I wasn't interested in apologies anymore. See, at some point this stopped being about my truck. It became about every person in that neighborhood who'd been quietly pushed around because fighting back sounded expensive or exhausting or impossible. And maybe part of that came from my divorce too, if I'm being honest. Spending years feeling like your life can be dismantled piece by piece changes something in you. You start recognizing that helpless feeling in other people. You start hating the sight of bullies. So when Richard asked, "What would it take to make this go away?" I just said, "You should probably ask your lawyer that." Then I hung up. Monday morning, I filed in County Small Claims Court. Nothing dramatic. No big courtroom speech. Just paperwork, evidence packets, statutes, photographs, call logs, and one very detailed timeline that made Ironclad look like they'd handed legal dynamite to a man with too much free time. The clerk behind the counter actually whistled while flipping through my documents. She said, "You came prepared." I told her, "I used to work insurance claims. Spite is basically a professional skill." She laughed harder than she probably should have. The summons went out that afternoon, and everything changed almost immediately. 2 days later, I came home from the grocery store, and the boot was gone. No call, no warning, no explanation. Just gone. For a second, I actually stood there confused, grocery bags hanging from my arms, staring at the tire marks in the gravel where it used to be. It felt weirdly anticlimactic, like the villain disappearing halfway through the movie. Then I noticed an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal notice from Ironclad Community Patrol stating the immobilization had been rescinded pending administrative review. Administrative review. That's corporate language for, oh God, this guy has evidence. But the real moment everything collapsed happened later that week during the HOA emergency board meeting. Now, technically, homeowners weren't supposed to record meetings, but Ellie's teenage son was apparently born with the moral flexibility of a documentary filmmaker, because somehow audio from that meeting spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. And let me tell you, hearing powerful people panic is one of life's underrated pleasures. One board member asked why Ironclad had enforced outside HOA jurisdiction. Another demanded to know whether other homeowners could sue too. Then Richard Bellamy apparently dropped the bomb that county zoning had already confirmed multiple overreach complaints tied to Ironclad over the previous year. That's when Trent lost his composure. According to the recording, he started blaming residents for being combative and accused homeowners of undermining community authority. At one point, he actually yelled, "If we stop enforcing aggressively, people stop respecting the rules." And there it was. Not safety, not order, respect. That's what this had always been about for him. The need to feel powerful. The crazy thing is, the moment that audio leaked, public opinion shifted overnight. People who'd stayed quiet suddenly started talking. Neighbors shared stories. Old finds resurfaced. Photos appeared in community Facebook groups. One guy claimed Ironclad threatened to tow his daughter's car during a medical emergency. Whether every story was true or not almost stopped mattering. Because once people stop trusting authority, every ugly interaction starts looking intentional. 3 days later, the HOA terminated Ironclad's contract. Just like that. Gone. No dramatic press release. No apology parade. Just a short email sent to residents saying the association would be transitioning toward a revised compliance approach. Corporate speak again. Translation: we need this problem to disappear immediately. About a week after that, I received a certified settlement letter. Ironclad agreed to reimburse every fee, pay additional damages, and cover filing costs if I dropped the lawsuit. Total payout came out to a little over $1,200. Not life-changing money, but that wasn't the satisfying part. The satisfying part came the next morning when I walked outside with a cup of coffee and realized something had changed in the neighborhood. It was quiet. No patrol SUVs creeping through the streets. No parking warnings tucked under windshield wipers. No Trent Mercer lurking around corners wearing mirrored sunglasses like a mall cop version of Batman. Just birds in the pine trees, sprinklers clicking in the distance, and my truck sitting peacefully on my own property where it had always belonged. And for the first time in weeks, I finally laughed for real. Not angry laughter, not disbelief, just relief. Although I'll admit, there's still one thing about this whole story that bothers me. A month after Ironclad disappeared, Ellie told me she saw Trent working private security over in Columbia County. Different uniform, same attitude. And honestly, that stuck with me more than the lawsuit did. Because people like Trent never really disappear. They just move somewhere new where nobody knows the history yet. Which is exactly why stories like this matter. Most abuse of power doesn't start with massive corruption. It starts with little moments where people assume nobody will push back. An illegal fine, a fake rule, a threat delivered with enough confidence that regular people just comply to avoid the headache. And maybe that's the real reason I took this whole thing so far. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the boot. It was about refusing to let somebody stand on my property and act like I needed permission to exist there. But I'll ask you this. If you were in my position, would you have fought it all the way like I did? Or would you have just paid the fee and moved on with your life? Because judging by some of the comments I still get from former neighbors, apparently not everybody thinks I handled it the right way.